Welcome back to another random making encounter, and today I needed to make some little braziers for a book nook. So let's just jump in and take a look at how I approached this project. For this project, I used 18 and 22 gauge copper craft wire, jewelry making wire. In retrospect, I think 20 and 22 would have been a little bit better, with the 20 being the heaviest. It'll really depend on how thick you want to hammer this out, how wide you want it to be. That will really drive the size of the wire. And obviously, the thicker the wire, the flatter and wider it will be when you hammer it out. Speaking of hammering it out, you need something heavy, metal to pound on. Doesn't need to be anything special. Some sort of a hammer, some wire cutters of any sort and nature, some pliers of some sort to bend stuff, some sort of nail set or something that you can wrap pieces around. Nail sets are really nice for this because they're tapered, and then a soldering iron. Having made a few of these, I know that about 6 inches of wire is all I need. I'm not going to actually roll it off the spool in case I need more or a little bit less, but I'm just going to straighten that out and then remove the plastic coating that prevents the copper from tarnishing. That will also prevent us from being able to solder it. At that point, it's time to really just start wailing on it. You don't really need anything special for this. A small hammer and something harder than copper to pound on. Doesn't need to be all that big, just something that you can flatten it out on. The goal here is to try to get it as even a width as possible, so one area isn't more flattened than the other. Does not need to be perfect, and all of these hammer marks are just fine. Once that's all good and hammered, I'm going to cut these into 1-inch sections, loosely, roughly. This is not jewelry making. This is creating hand-forged dungeon torch braziers of doom, so any variation is okay. I want to arrange them eventually in sort of a little star pattern, a little asterisk pattern. So I want to flatten them out just to make sure they're going to lay roughly flat while I try to solder them and they start squirming around. And soldering's where this is sort of where it gets to be a little tricky. So I tried using a little bit of rosin to initially stick them together, a little bit of flux. The nice thing about this is it does allow the solder to flow better between the pieces. The downside is rosin is sticky right up until it's heated with a soldering iron, and then it becomes liquid, and then it almost acts as a bit of a lubricant, and things just start to slide all around. So I would say this is pretty optional. If you're using a rosin core solder, the rosin in that, the flux in that, a flux core, some sort of solder with a flux in it, will really do the same thing. And so, grain of salt there. Now, once it's all positioned, I'm using these tweezers to hold everything initially in place. Copper is a great heat conductor, and so these will get really hot as you're soldering, and you don't want to go in and reach and grab it. You have a nice little star pattern, first degree burn on your hand. So I picked up a little bit of solder on the tip of the soldering iron to try and just tack it in place. It takes a little bit of time for the piece to get hot enough overall. Like I said, copper is a great conductor, so it's just soaking up all of the heat off of the iron. Hold that in place a little bit. Everything's getting nice and crispy and hot, and it's melting, and it's sliding that rosin all around, but it kind of sort of held in place. This is the fiddliest, finicky part. It's just, thankfully these do not have to be perfect and pretty. Come back in a little bit with some actual wire solder, and then we call it a day. It's all holding in place, and we are happy. Once it cools and I can actually touch it, I'm going to reach in most of the way into the center, maybe 1/8 of an inch or so, a few millimeters out, and just bend each of the pieces up. Continue around to do this, and this is already, you can see, starting to form sort of that basket of the brazier. I'm not even sure if this is a brazier. Is that the right term? Post a comment. But bending this up to create sort of this little cupped thing. I spent a little bit of time trying to straighten these out to make them as even as possible, sort of consistent. It's not super duper critical that it's perfect. Again, we're not really going for perfection here. Just sort of even. You can see that the tips, the lengths are a little bit off. It's okay if you actually start a little bit longer. It gives you a little bit more flexibility on shaping those final pieces at the end when we start to bend and curl them over. Too short and you won't have enough. The next thing is to actually make the bands that hold it together. And so for that, what I'm going to do is take some of my remaining piece that I've flattened out, and I'm going to wrap it around something like this nail set, this punch. Now, the nice thing about that is it is tapered, so I can start a little bit small and sort of stretch it up on the taper to make it bigger. To do this, I actually wrap it and overlap it, which allows me then to kind of come in and cut it a little long and then start to expand it, and then I'll eventually just snip it flush. So I'll snip across the overlap and kind of get an even end. Now, I kind of suck at this a little bit, and so I generally, even when I do try to do this, I end up with a little bit of gappiness. Again, doesn't really matter. These are tiny. They just get a bunch of paint over them anyway, and weathering and rust and stuff like that. So don't get too hung up. The goal here is to make it so that it slides up on the top. This is the top band, so it kind of slides up. It will pinch in the prongs, we'll call them the prongs, and we want to see if it's similar to the ones we're trying to match. But the prongs will actually sort of help hold it in place while you solder. So you don't want it too loose so that it slips and slides around. We kind of want a snug fit, and we don't want to scrunch it too much, pinch them too closed. We want to just kind of fiddle with it to get that shape where we want it. At that point, I'm going to trim the excess and align the ends as well as possible. My flush cutters were kind of dull, and so a lot of these cuts kind of sucked. Had to order a new pair of... I'm really rough on flush cut. I cut stuff that's too hard and then they get dented and chunked up. So enough of that. But aligning this really to that top end, making sure it's even around as much as possible, and just kind of play with this is part of sort of that, again, more of that fiddly bit. Now, the thing to note is I'm not trying to line them up to the ends of the pieces because those are just all over the place. I really want to make sure it's aligned and flush to the base of the torch holder thing we're calling a brazier. Once I'm really satisfied with that, I need enough extending past the end to bend eventually. But once I'm happy with the overall positioning, it's time to really just solder this up. Now, I've used the rosin in the past, but it required a little bit of cleanup afterwards before I started to paint, so I'm just going straight to solder. The solder that I have is a flux core or rosin core, so it should be fine. Now you can see I'm actually applying heat to the opposite side of the band. My goal here is to try and flow it under from the other side rather than sort of hit it from the tip of the soldering iron. One thing to be careful here is if you're heating this whole thing up, because copper can really conduct heat, you want to be careful that you don't get it so hot that you loosen the solder joint at the base. Here's a close-up of just this really horrible crude soldering that I'm doing. I touch the soldering iron at the top a little bit just to create more surface area for the heat to transfer, but that's really what I'm doing there. Once everything is soldered, and you don't need to solder each prong, just a couple, 3 on a few sides to hold it in place, just to tack it in place. I'm gonna snip those ends to be a little bit more even, and then take my little pliers and just bend them out to create that little flare at the top. And you could take some round nose pliers and sort of bend a curve into it. There's a bunch that could happen, but these are so small that just a little bit of a flare is all we needed there. That sits a lot nicer on the table. And now it's time to sort of rinse and repeat and do the exact same thing for the second band that goes around the base. I did a little bit more pre-shaping here before I snipped it off just to make it fit a little bit better. It's easier to go bigger than smaller. That's kind of what it looks like fit, and then a little bit of solder to tack it into place. All right. Exciting stuff. It's kind of looking like it should, though. It's kind of looking like a brazier. Now I'm going to switch to the thinner wire. This is the 22 gauge, I think, because wire gauges are backwards. And I cut a couple sections that are probably maybe 4 inches long, give or take 5 inches long. In a second, you'll see what I'm doing here. But basically, I'm threading them through, and I'm just running them across diagonally. This is going to form the handle of the torch. And so I want to crisscross applesauce them on these this piece, and just the hard part here is, and this is where the extra thickness of the brazier, the basket part, kind of became a challenge, is the gaps were kind of small. So I had to fight them through a little bit. Keep in mind that you do, as you're soldering the bands up, you want to have enough room to be able to wiggle these wires through like this. And then I'll just bend them down and just sort of crimp them, scrunch them up nice and tight to the base. So this is attaching the handle to the basket. I thought at this point of maybe thinking about soldering in or twisting in the LED, but there's a lot of reasons why I think that's fraught with peril, and I could ruin or burn the wires or solder the wires. It just was too risky. So I just figured I would find a way to run the wires in separately afterwards. Trying to really have a nice tight twist on this, I'm holding onto the wire and I'm just rotating that basket around. I want to keep these ends splayed a little bit, and you'll see why in a minute, because I'm going to pick out one of them and wrap it back to sort of form the base. But a nice tight twist on this. If you want a thicker handle, use a slightly thicker wire. And so the wire is really, the thickness of the wire is really determining the overall dimensions of the brazier. So trying to be even as possible. I'm going for about an inch was what I was shooting for these particular pieces. And so I just keep checking it. I don't want to over twist it, actually, because then I'm going to have to unwind. So that's why I'm checking it all of the time. Once I get to about an inch, you'll see I'm going to bring back one of the wires. I'm going to pick, in this case, really just the longest one to make my life easier. And I'm going to wrap it back on itself. So this is going to form the base of the torch. So I wanted a little extra thickness here to form an additional sort of decorative element to it. I'm just going to keep the same number of twists across all of them. So in this case, I think I had about 4 or 5 twists. And you can change this up however you want for yours. Once I'm all satisfied with that and everything looks good, I'll just trim everything flush. This is a really solid mounting way to get this handle. Everything, this is a very, very sturdy thing. The next thing I want to do is build up the base a little bit of the brazier. You could actually stop right there and just move on, but I felt like it needed a little extra something. So again, using the thinner wire, I just wrapped down onto the handle. And then once I came down on the handle, maybe 2 or 3 wraps, I started to wrap back up. I would say you could actually do a bunch of different things here instead of using wire. It's a little uneven just because of the way that the wires twist. But realistically, I found that it was a nice way to add some bulk or mass to below the basket. And then, you know, not just have it feel like there were a bunch of wires going into it. What I'll end up doing is, in a second, filling a lot of this with a lot of solder to just fill that into a solid chunk and to sort of take away the sense of it being wire. I actually like the wire portion of the handle though. If you look at a lot of wrought iron work, it is twisted metal in handles, so it has sort of that twisted wrought iron feel a little bit. Hitting it with a little bit of rosin just to create a, you know, cleanup issue later on before painting, but it does help, again, always with the flow of the solder, so, you know, just gonna do it. And then at this point, it's a lot of just feeding a lot of solder into the piece. I'm working on a silicone electronics mat, so it's not going to melt. That's why I'm soldering on something that looks like a big chunk of plastic. You can solder on a chunk of something that's not your favorite dining room table with its beautiful antique French varnish finish. This area up at the top takes a fair amount of solder as well. You're really just flowing that in, feeding it in until it feels about as much as it's going to take. The nice thing here is I'm really just sort of the goal here is I'm trying to knock back that sense of wire. I did do a little bit of cleanup. You don't really need to do a lot of it, but I had a little, you know, little needle file and a little bit of filing just to flatten out the blobs, make it feel a little less like, you know, chunks of solder. But at that point, once this is done, it really is about a little bit of priming, a little bit of painting. I just use regular model, acrylic model figure miniature primers and paints for this. Normal weathering stuff, rust, whatever you want to do, metallic finishes. It works out really well. You know, it's copper. You probably could even patina it with some sort of a patina, but I'm really lazy and don't want to mess with chemicals, so I'm just going to do it all with paint. And that's it. The more you do, the better you get. I wish I could say kind of the same. I don't know if I'm getting better, but you know, they're not bad. And for the size they are and the place that they fit in my book nook, I think that they have the right sort of vibe to them. I did explore other materials, like I even 3D printed some of them. I thought about styrene, but the thing I love about these is just how rugged they are. They're not going to come apart, and it's just a really, really sturdy little piece of kit here. So I do hope you found this interesting. If you did, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed already. It's always good to see you back, and we will be back with another random making encounter really soon.